like you're talking to me. So John, tell me about
I really
yourself.
founded Aspen Research as a medical, legal, and environmental research firm that helps people get to the proper resources to combat either cancer, lupus, or multiple chemical sensitivities. And we're really seeing a lot more environmental illness from multiple chemical sensitivities today than I think they've ever seen before. But historically, in doing some research, the term chemical sensitivities goes back to 1916. British military physicians first noted that the troops that were exposed to mustard gas, phosgene gas, and chlorine were developing chemical sensitivities. They would have no sensitivities to chemicals. They would be exposed to these gases, and they would develop chemical sensitivities. They would become allergic to the other gases. In World War I, 25% of all the casualties were gas casualties. So you had a huge amount of servicemen coming out of World War I with chemical sensitivities, or multiple chemical sensitivities. Hitler was exposed. Teddy Roosevelt's son was a gas casualty who was sick for most of his life. 25% of all U.S. casualties were chemical casualties. So this really started to shape not only medical science, but it also started to shape the nation. Phoenix, Arizona experienced a boom after World War I when most of the poisoned veterans realized they felt better in Phoenix. So word of mouth spread, and you had a lot of veterans moving out there. Now, in 1916, 1917, what the family physicians and what the physicians were telling these people is, if you move out to the beach, if you move out to the desert, if you move to the mountains, in about 7 years, you'll be about as good as you're going to get. But in 1916, 1917, they weren't having multiple exposures after they got sick. They were basically eating what we would call now organic food, and they were feeling much better. So many of them did improve. But you see, Gulf War syndrome isn't a new syndrome. It's a very old syndrome. It occurred in 1916. In 1925, you had the Italians were using gas in Africa. The British military was using gas in Afghanistan, so you were having the same complaints. Probably the largest outbreak occurred in 1978 when China invaded Vietnam. Vietnam fired gas shells at the Chinese troops. The Chinese troops started to develop Gulf War syndrome or multiple chemical sensitivities. So in the 80s, you started to see Chinese physicians, military physicians, started to come to the United States and started to study with the Environmental Protection Agency, scientific advisors, and started to study pesticide poisoning. Now in World War II, the Germans developed a gas called sarin, which is an organophosphate. It's the same chemical that we now would term as a pesticide. There were no known treatments for it, no known cure, and there was no way to avoid exposure. This was the same gas that was used in Iran and Iraq and in the Gulf War. The only reason the Germans didn't use it was because they had no treatment for it. After the war, many of the German scientists who had developed sarin were turned around and they were hired by W.R. Grace and Dow Chemical to work in pesticide development. So sarin is really the mother of modern pesticides. So when you look at something like Gulf War syndrome, you can go back and you can study the legal cases for pesticide poisoning, and you see the exact same complaints. Memory loss, dizziness, chemical sensitivities, rage disorders, agoraphobia, fear. Many of these psychological symptoms were noted in the 40s and 50s. So it's not really a new problem. This problem has been going on since this century began.
Tell us a little bit about
This century began.
Tell us a little bit about what you know about happened in Vietnam.
Well, Vietnam, they used a product called Agent Orange, which is a plant hormone. What it does is it just causes plants to grow themselves to death. So it has to be applied during the growing season. But it was also contaminated with dioxin, which is an it can mimic the female hormone estrogen. Also, the Gulf War, the Vietnam veterans, they heavily used a product called chlordane in Vietnam. They used it to bug-proof the barracks. They used it to treat the scout dogs for fleas and ticks. So many of the veterans not only were exposed to Agent Orange, they were also exposed to chlordane. Chlordane causes a wide variety of neurological symptoms, and many of the post-traumatic stress disorders are actually probably chlordane exposures. The scout dogs in Vietnam suffered 50% cancer. 50% of the scout dogs were ill. The individuals who were treating and spraying the Agent Orange and the chlordane were also ill.
Hang on 1 second. Okay.
So you had a lot of Vietnam veterans exposed not only to Agent Orange but also to chlordane. When they came back to the United States, a lot of them had a very high level of neurological problems. 25% of all homeless today are Vietnam veterans. These were men who at one time could fly helicopters, get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and work all day long. 25% of them are now homeless, or 25% of all homeless are now Vietnam veterans. Today, we've reached a milestone. As of today, we have lost more Vietnam veterans to suicide than we lost in combat. So Vietnam veterans came back suffering from a very high level of depression. Depression is also something that's been, depression and suicide have increased by 171% from 1950 to 1970, one generation. Farmers who use high levels of pesticides suffer suicide at 5 times the rate of the normal population. So stress can affect the release of pesticides. Many of these pesticides store in the fat, so you can not only get sick from the initial exposure, but when you're under stress, you can actually dump the pesticides out of the fat back to the blood, and people can suffer stress-induced pesticide poisoning.
So what you're saying is that the Vietnam vets who are committing suicide and the Vietnam vets who are homeless, it's not just the psychological effects of a war that was not a popular one and became displaced, that there may be, in fact, some physical component to the creation of these psychological symptoms.
There is a neuropsychological component. Many physicians have noted what they call a rage disorder. When you're exposed to organophosphates and organochlorines, you can suffer a rage disorder. Physicians who have been exposed to pesticides have noted that they suffered from a rage disorder. They've also noticed rage disorders in animals. Animals exposed will act in a very aggressive manner. So it's not uncommon at all. So when we look at some of the cost to society, some of the increased levels of crime, some of the increased levels of crime among veterans, medical experts do suspect that it has a chemical aspect to it.
Now, how come, how did you get interested in particularly dealing with the military?
Well, I served briefly in the Marine Corps. I started to interview a lot of veterans. I'm an honorary member of the Oklahoma Vietnam Veterans Association. So I started working with some of the Oklahoma veterans and some of the Vietnam veterans. And then I turned around and saw the exact same symptoms being displayed in the Gulf War veterans. So I've tried to do several projects to try and put the word out that if you are ill, if you are suffering from depression, mental illness, schizophrenia, you know, it may not be a mental illness. There may be a chemical aspect to it. These chemicals are designed to work by disturbing neurobrain chemicals. That's how they kill. They actually confuse the body to death. They cause confusion, and the body can no longer breathe. The heart can no longer beat. So a mild dose will cause just enough mental confusion that you're doing poorly in school, or you may be engaging in spousal abuse.
So you serving in the service, did you have friends that were
Yes.
affected by this? Yeah.
I saw many of the older Vietnam veterans who have a very high rate of cancer. I've interviewed several who have had birth defects in their children. I've interviewed several squadron leaders from Gulf War who are ill. I've interviewed one Special Forces officer who was ill. So it really hit people very hard, and they realized that it's not a psychological problem. Now, it's not only a problem in the United States. The Czechoslovakian forces are also sick from Gulf War syndrome. The Canadian forces, several Iranian medical universities have found that their veterans are also suffering from very high levels of birth defects that mimic the same birth defects that the Gulf War syndrome veterans are suffering from.
So they're showing that the Gulf War veterans, the ones who the government are saying this disease really isn't a valid disease, are having children that are clearly genetically responding to their father or mother who was in the Gulf War.
Well, the National Foundation for Birth Defects noted that environmental illness is a birth defect. And they noted that a lot of the Vietnam veterans are having children born with environmental illness. They're born sick and they stay sick. Now, the veterans from World War I, a lot of them were sick at 18 in 1918, and a lot of them were sick until 1980 when they died. So I think you're going to see the same problem in Gulf War syndrome. I think they're going to be sick until they're 80.
So you mentioned that you thought there are historical parallels to MCS or EI.
Well, now the recently released tobacco documents show that the tobacco corporations, their doctors, and their lawyers were actively trying to conceal the dangers of tobacco. They were actually trying to bribe government officials. They were engaged in severe ethical. They were not telling the truth. If you look at asbestos back in the 20s and 30s, they knew this product was killing their workers. They were sending memos back and forth stating the product is going to kill their workers, but let's keep it quiet. Their attorneys were involved in the concealment. So I think that when you look at some of the chemical problems, you can also see that there's an active, there's definitely a financial interest to keep this information from being publicly discussed.
Yeah. So what's your theory why MCS isn't widely recognized?
Well, I think the physician who first diagnosed SAD, seasonally acquired depression, probably put it in a nutshell. He said that when he diagnosed SAD, he came up with a theory that sunlight can affect your brain. If you don't get enough sunlight, you can become depressed. He put this idea out. It was widely accepted, and now people can get treatment. But he said he wasn't up against the dark industry. He said nobody was making a profit off darkness. So he said here he broached this extremely new view. It was instantly accepted. He said that science doesn't take place in a vacuum. Science is affected by profits, profit motives, and who stands to gain and who stands to lose.
And the chemical companies stand to lose.
Well, the 7 largest companies in the world are all chemical companies. They manufacture the pharmaceuticals that you use to treat someone for depression. They also manufacture many of the pesticides that can cause depression. The same chemical company that manufactures a drug used to treat cancer, another division may manufacture a drug that causes cancer.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no conflict of interest when they're seeking a profit.
Okay. Okay. Let's see. Well, since you're involved in legal work, I noticed that there, obviously, the more people have MCS and the more people fight their cases and more cases are coming to court, whether they're fighting HUD for special accommodation for the landlord not to use harsh chemicals, for landladies and landlords to not discriminate against their tenants if they are MCS and to not deny them tenancy. Say a little bit about the trend in courts today. Are they recognizing multiple chemical sensitivities as a disability, as a special accommodation, and what are the trends?
Today, patients and plaintiffs lose about 60% of their cases if they're lucky enough to go to trial. So they have a very high hurdle. It's a recognized disease, but it's not well recognized. So I think the courts have a long way to go before plaintiffs actually start to get justice. No, the average person has a very hard time getting an attorney. Most of these cases are not brought to trial. Most of them are settled out for about $30,000 to $40,000 apiece.
Okay. Well, I guess what I want to know is where we're going to get the referrals and the resources for all this information. Like where, you know what I mean? Because you're giving us a lot of facts.
You mean where are the footnotes?
Yeah.
I guess you have to wait for the book to come out. No, this is all public documents.
Okay. Well, maybe we should say a little bit about that you've been researching this for a book that you're writing about.
Maybe just for. Are we still running the tape there?
Yep.
I think that there's a lot of research out there. Anyone can go to any medical library and look up a solvent or the chemical they've been exposed to.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of this research goes back to the 40s and 50s. Most of it's public documents, so it's not hard for anybody to find out what the chemical they were exposed to causes, what are some of the damages. Any law library can tell them, what are prior cases. Is anybody else sick? Has anybody else been sick from chlordane, from Dursban, malathion?
Great. Okay. You come to Santa Fe
in the fall of '93.
And why did you come?
Well, the immediate reason was living in Santa Barbara, and a gardener dumped some Dursban in the yard, and it came through the open windows on an August day and contaminated the whole house and all of our things. And we decided maybe that was a sign to move on. So wanted to come to the Southwest to see if less mold and cleaner air would help health. And we took a trip and looked at Prescott, Arizona, Snowflake, Santa Fe, and Taos, and looked for housing. And I don't know that we necessarily had picked Santa Fe, but there was a sublet available, and we just decided to take it, and then went home, packed up, and moved.
Wow. Okay. Well, are you ready to?
Yeah, Mom.
Okay. So what were you doing at the time you were living in Santa Barbara before the exposure?
Meaning?
In terms of your work, in terms of your lifestyle, what?
Well, I got sick. I was living in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area, and I was working for Kaiser Permanente in Richmond in the gynecology department. And what first disabled me was a back injury. And I picked up a box, and then I had terrible sciatica in both legs, and basically then was bedridden for like the next 9 months. And it didn't respond normally. Most people, it was a protruding disc, and people be up and about. It would never go down, actually. So over that time, I was having worsening food problems that I hadn't identified with environmental problems yet. But I had a bad reaction to some salmon and ended up in the emergency room. And right around, actually was within several days after my MRI scan to check my back. And I believe that that had an influence.
Okay, I just need to clarify one thing for me. You were in San Francisco before you were in Santa Barbara.
Well, the true picture is I lived in Santa Barbara for 10 years,
Okay.
and I moved back to the Bay Area where I'd grown up in '85. And it was when I was up there that I got sick. And I think I was having worsening, well, I know I was having worsening food problems for several years. And then I did the lift the box and had the back problem that was sort of inexplicably not healing, and the food situation was getting worse and worse. I couldn't take any medications for my back, nothing orally at that time. And then about 9 months later, I was trying to, I thought maybe my back wasn't healing because I wasn't being nourished enough, because I wasn't eating anything but about 13 vegetables at the time. And so I tried some allegedly hypoallergenic protein powder that just about killed me. And over the course of a couple of days, that's where I always say my sense of smell increased 25%, or 25 times. And that then it was like somebody ripped my skin off and the covering off my brain. Every molecule that was going by was causing my stomach to cramp up, and headache and dizziness and metallic taste in my mouth and stuff like that. So I really had a rough couple of weeks, but where I couldn't eat and I couldn't sleep, and I really thought I was a goner at that time. And I finally pulled out of it enough to where I could eat 3 vegetables with some vegetable oil. I was living at the time in an old moldy trailer that I had sprayed for ants. And of course that's where I'd been lying 24 hours a day with the back injury. And when this really dramatic reaction happened, I couldn't go back in the trailer, and I had to throw a mattress out on in the yard, and I basically lived there for about 5 months. And that was the summer from hell, for sure. And over that time, my thyroid function went down to 0, essentially, and I thought I was a goner again because I hadn't been able to tolerate any kind of supplements or medications. But in fact, I was able, with some difficulty, to get on supplementation. And then I also found an indoor place to live, not in any ordinary fashion, mind you, but and so I'd say I've slowly gotten better since that winter of 1990. And I always say it's like Woody Allen says, the miserable and the horrible. It's like I'm still miserably disabled, but I'm not at the intensive care level, which I felt like for a long time.
So the incident with in Santa Barbara happened in '93.
93.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And the combination of my back, which is still a big part of my disability, I really was basically lying down for about 4 years, and I only began sitting at all when I moved to New Mexico, and I began driving finally in the last year or two. But I still can't go upstairs and can't go up a slope. can't exercise at all, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm.
I also, I'm better with food, but actually I still just eat 9 foods. I was up, after I was down to just broccoli at one time. I got up at one time to about 10 or 11 foods and had another bad reaction, and which is a scary thing, because if I try something new, it won't be a matter of just, oh, it's not going to work for me, stop it. It's sort of double or nothing. I could say, well, I'm eating 9 foods, do I want to try to eat 10? But if I'm wrong, I could go back down to 5. So I'm at about 9 foods now on a 3-day rotation.
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel as sick all the time as I used to. But
Mm-hmm.
that's still the really critical thing with my illness, is the food sensitivities. And I'm always living in fear of getting a flu or something like that that could tip me over, and I could really lose my ability to eat again.
Mm-hmm. Tell me. Mm-hmm. Tell me about your housing situation. Has that affected your health, and have you had what's your housing history been like since you've been in Santa Fe?
Well, I like to go back to the housing history since I started with my illness. Like I said, I was living in this trailer, and then I couldn't tolerate an indoor space when I got so acutely ill. And I was living, just living outside for about 5 months. Then I was able to find a guest house in the East Bay, and I had somebody check it out for me, because everything was so overwhelming at the time. I couldn't tell. Everything seemed bad, but somebody said, no, I think this is not going to harm you. Well, it turns out it was horribly moldy, but luckily mold is like not my worst thing. And so I was able to then just take up residence in one corner of the living room. The curious thing there was I did pretty well for a year, relatively speaking, and then the skunks started. And I lived near a creek, which was great. There was all kind of wildlife, and it was a drought or something happened. So instead of like 2 or 3 nights in the end of January during the mating season, there might be some bad skunk, it was all night, every day, for 9 months straight. And it was really killing me. I was, my stomach was working less. I had a constant headache. And I was desperate. There was no place I could go. So one night, after my mother had come across the bay to try to rescue me, we had driven all over the county and could still not find air to breathe. We went to the Berkeley Marina and were sleeping in a parking lot where you're not supposed to sleep, and the foghorn went off and about scared the hell out of us, about jumped out of the car. Anyway, I try to think, I just have to get some clean air, what can I do? And so I invited some people over. This was after a long night, and I decided to build an aluminum foil tent to surround me. And so that's what we did. We just laid out aluminum foil, made these giant sheets, and wrapped it around just over a pole that I had in the house that I knew I could tolerate. And I taped that up and put 2 air filters in it. So I was kind of like in a spaceship. And I spent about 16 hours a day cramped in there for the next 9 months. And during the day, the skunk would go, odor would go away. It would burn off. If it was sunny, it would burn off sooner, about 11. And I'd be okay until nightfall. As long as I had some time to get out of there and breathe, I did it. And one day, it never cleared, and I just thought, I can't stand this anymore. And I called my mom again, and she came and got me. And so for the next 6 weeks, I lived in my car. Is actually this was a miracle. It was her car, and it was tolerable for me. And so I was living in my parents' driveway, in the car. And eventually, I was able to work my way into one of their back bedrooms for about the next 6 or 7 months. And at that, finally, decided to try to go to Santa Barbara. And my partner and I went there, and she had a friend who had a place that was environmentally, they had done with sort of environmental stuff in mind. And I couldn't sleep in it, and I couldn't cook on their stove, but it was sort of a place to go. And Santa Barbara being sort of more outdoors, that was kind of helpful. But it's also just full of pollen, pesticides, mold, and stuff like that. But I always loved it, and so I wanted to be there. So then we had to, we only had that for like a month or two. We had to look for something else, and we put money down on another house which we didn't realize till the day we were supposed to move in that it was so moldy that we couldn't be in it. So I lived again in the car in the yard for that month, and she lived in a tent. And we always laughed because there was 2 cats, and they had a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house to themselves. And then we found this other big kind of guest house on the estate of an estate in Montecito, which they generally didn't use pesticides. And then that was the place where we ended up getting run out of. And when we came here, we were in an El Dorado passive solar type of a house, and it had some, as it turned out, some mystery solvent problem that really was starting to wipe me out. I thought I wasn't making the adjustment to New Mexico, but that was only a temporary thing, and then we moved into where we are now, and I actually did right when we got to this house. I've done better. And now the house is being sold. This has been about 3.5 years, and I hate to leave it, of course, because I know that I can survive in it. Now half the house is unusable because of mold problems, and there's too much dust and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, it's scary going somewhere else. But mainly, I just, my food life is so sort of careful. If I have a place where I know I can cook and eat at the times that I need to eat, and there's a shower and a driveway. I still have my mom's car, and so then I know that, I sort of always say, well, life support will have been achieved. And but I have to say, I mean, I've gotten really spoiled, like living indoors, but it's never that far away, and I appreciate it every day, having a roof over my head.
So do you think this area of the country is better for people with MCS than other places?
Do you want me to answer your question? Or just answer you, or sort of repeat your question?
Oh,
that's what sometimes it's like.
Yeah, repeat her question.
Like say, I
do
think
a complete sentence. Yeah, right.
I think New Mexico generally is better for chemically sensitive folks. We certainly had plenty of people come to this area, and although some people can't tolerate it for various reasons, I think the general impression is most people are doing a little better. It's no panacea, and you trade off maybe inner city pollution with hardships in terms of extremes of hot and cold, high altitude, terrible pollen at different times. The dryness is a problem for other people and stuff like that. But my impression is I think most people do better. Now, housing is as big a crisis here as anywhere, though, and so we have a nonprofit group called the Healthy Housing Coalition, and we've been trying to address this crisis in housing, and it's been pretty frustrating. We wish we could really build something and have something that we could make available.
Because there are so many people with multiple chemical sensitivities that seem to be coming specifically to Santa Fe area, and there aren't.
One thing I wanted to say about Santa Fe that was a pleasant surprise was that not only is the air cleaner, but there's just been incredible numbers of neat people, both other EI folks, but just the general community at large has been very accepting. And I was concerned leaving California. I was reading some old notes that I was afraid I was leaving all my friends behind, and I would say that's one of the greatest strengths about being here is our sense of community and what we've been able to do to work together and to help each other out. And I know I have friends that moved to other parts of the country where they're really alone with a lot of their struggle, and even if the air is good, that's an awful big hardship to live with.
Okay, great.
All right, don't move.
So would you tell me a little bit about your housing history since you've been ill?
Doesn't matter what I say.
No.
It's been horrible.
Yeah.
Like most people.
All right, I'm rolling.
Okay, so what was your profession before you became ill?
I'm a physician, and I graduated from UCLA Medical School. I'm a physician, and I graduated from UCLA Medical School. I did an internship in internal medicine and then got my license, so officially I'm a general practitioner. I worked in primary care community clinics in Santa Barbara, and then fairly quickly focused on women's health and gynecology, office gynecology, and family planning. And I worked at UC Santa Barbara Student Health Services for about 5 years, and when I got sick I was working in the Kaiser Permanente Richmond gynecology office.
Okay.
Some physicians that work for the chemical industry have made the comment that this is the only illness where the patients define what it is and decide whether they have it. And while I don't think that that is true, what I think is even more amazing is that this is probably the only illness where the people who have it have to do the research, educate the doctors, develop public policy, and try various types and develop their own kinds of treatments and be their own guinea pigs.
Okay. And I'm rolling. Okay, now you do have to point the mic to him.
The one thing I tell people over and over again is that the cure is in the cause. It doesn't matter if you're talking about multiple chemical sensitivities, leukemia, depression. If you find out what's causing it, you can start to treat it. So it makes no sense to treat a child with $40,000, $50,000 of chemotherapy unless you test his blood and test his house and find out if the chloridane in the house caused the leukemia. You can't send a child back into a contaminated house or he's never going to beat cancer. It's the same with multiple chemical sensitivities. As soon as these people start to realize what's causing their illness, then they already have a leg up on avoiding it, maybe detoxifying it from their body and feeling better.
So it seems like the main task here is to educate.
I'd say the main task is to educate and to teach yourself how to heal yourself.
What do you think about that? Well, what do you do in the task force that specifically? What are the areas that you focus on in the task force?
In the task force, we are advocating for people who have multiple chemical sensitivities, focusing on disability issues and access issues and that kind of thing. There's a lot of education that goes on, both because a lot of the attitudinal barriers are what leads to other types of barriers. The other important aspect to our work is to try to prevent this illness from occurring in other people. I think that's still an unanswered question, even though it appears that chemical exposures are some part of causing the illness, and that by reducing chemical exposures, you're reducing the chance that you or your child will get it. We would want people to know that, at least for other people, when they've moved into a newly remodeled, or moved into a new house or a remodeled office, or their child has gone to a new school and has gotten sick, and it would seem prudent then to try to keep your children and your child's environment as free from pollutants as possible.
Hang on.
Mental institute, and they have no idea why they're sick.
Mm-hmm.
So it is an upper, in the higher education you've got, I think you have a better chance of getting to the answers, because a lot of times the answers are hidden.
Well, considering that you have to basically have a PhD in MCS to sort of live with it, people that the amount of information that you need, or that, if you are somebody that reads a lot or goes to the library, you're going to more likely pick up the information than if they're more a working class kind of person. But, we certainly have people in the task force that are working class, and a lot of people that don't have a lot of education that know that perfume's bothering them, pesticides are bothering them, smoke's bothering them. Dr. Meggs' study in North Carolina, where they found that 33% said that they were reacting somewhat to various types of common chemicals, and that went across age, income, educational level, and race. And the only thing was that they had found that more women than men got it. And we are starting to verify that information for New Mexico. And extremely preliminary results of a New Mexico prevalence study, we're finding 15% being so unusually chemically sensitive, 2 to 3% being diagnosed with MCS, and 1.5% or so that have lost their job or career because of the illness. And because of the demographic information that will come along with this study by the end of the year, I'm really quite confident that we'll be able to show that it really does cross all those barriers.
Well, what I found in my research and talking to some of the physicians is that it is more a woman's disease because testosterone apparently helps detoxify some of the chemicals. So when I've talked to some of the Gulf War veterans, in mixed companies, more of the women did get sick than the men, which I think is one of the reasons why this has been ignored, as a lot of diseases, like multiple sclerosis for a long time was a woman's disease, and it was ignored.
I think it's pretty clear that women are getting this more than men, but it's certainly not exclusively so.
No.
And the various theories that I'm fond of is that women, pound for pound, have less ability to detoxify. That's why, in the same amount of alcohol that a woman would drink as a man, as compared to a man, a woman will, get more inebriated, be more affected. The other thing is that there are gender differences between immune systems, and I think it's in the womb, it differentiates male and female, but then it's also influenced by, as you said, male and female hormones later in life. And it seems also pretty clear that women are more prone to autoimmune diseases, and we've talked about some of the multiple sclerosis, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and we know that there's an awful lot of autoantibodies that are formed with chemical injury and with multiple chemical sensitivity. And I think that maybe a combination of those factors is the reason why women are more affected.
Well, I've also seen that in some of the interviews in some of the toxic homes. First of all, a lot of times the pets will get sick. Then the children, and then the wife, and then finally the bread earner. The husband is saying, no, there's nothing wrong with the house because he's not sick, and then finally he gets sick. So I do see that.
Speaking of house as well, it's I heard that you recently had some action with the legislature trying to get some information, education, get some bills passed. I'm not really sure what's happening. Can you just talk about that a bit?
Yes, the Multiple Chemical Sensitivity Task Force of New Mexico was formed in the fall of 1995. And in the 96 legislature, we had a memorial passed that asked our state disability organization, the Governor's Committee on Concerns of the Handicapped, to look into the kinds of problems faced by chemically sensitive New Mexicans. And we did that. We helped them through the summer and had a town hall meeting and helped them write a report that went back to one of the legislative committees. And based on that, we developed 7 pieces of legislation for 97, and it included trying to get more citizens on a pesticide advisory board, trying to get a little bit of local control of pesticides.
I heard that you recently had some action with the legislature trying to get some information, education, get some bills passed. I'm not really sure what's happening. Can you just talk about that a bit?
Yes, the Multiple Chemical Sensitivity Task Force of New Mexico was formed in the fall of 1995. And in the 96 legislature, we had a memorial passed that asked our state disability organization, the Governor's Committee on Concerns of the Handicapped, to look into the kinds of problems faced by chemically sensitive New Mexicans. And we did that. We helped them through the summer and had a town hall meeting and helped them write a report that went back to one of the legislative committees. And based on that, we developed 7 pieces of legislation for 97, and it included trying to get more citizens on a pesticide advisory board, trying to get a little bit of local control of pesticides. We put in for money for some transitional housing that would have been built up in the Taos area. And we had several memorials, one looking to develop hospital accessibility guidelines and looking at, again, more housing, and another one where we were interested in some IPM, integrated pest management, for the state schools. And unfortunately, none of those passed, but we certainly made our issues well known in the legislature. Many people very complimentary, longtime sort of lobbyists and legislators saying that we had done a good job getting our issues out there, and they fully expect us to be back, next year. And in the meantime, we are continuing to work with many of these entities. The Pesticide Advisory Board is being activated according to the old statute, and they've invited one of our members to be part of that.
Great.
And several other projects that are in the works.
That's great.
One thing I'd like to say about it is the point has to be made, this was not...
Hold on 1 second. Make it around there. Wait 1 second. Okay.
This was not journalism in an ordinary sense, where somebody's asking the questions, gee, I wonder what about this MCS, I wonder what it is, I'll get opinions from various sides and I'll gather evidence. Clearly in this case it was John Stossel on his scam-busting mission, and even though he has no medical degree and he is not an expert in any kind of disability, he decided ahead of time, apparently with his producers, that this was not an illness, this was a scam, and then he produced a show based on that. It's basically completely outrageous and hurtful, and one wonders, would he be capable of doing that for people with AIDS, that they're faking it, or people with diabetes that they're faking it? And that's it.
Well, there was a couple of articles published on that by people who used to work for 2020 and have since quit. And many of those articles talked about how upset the employees were with how 2020 had slandered these disabled individuals. Many of them had quit. Many of them had talked about some of the conflict of interest that 2020 has with the some of the spouses work for industry and work in the public relations business. I know that when I try and get an article published in a magazine, they'll frankly say, look, we can't publish it because of the advertising dollars at stake here. The insurance industry in the United States has between $460 billion of assets and $1 trillion in assets. And the insurance industry says, we're not going to recognize multiple chemical sensitivities because it's just too expensive to cover it. Then you look at the chemical industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar business, and they also state that you're not going to be able to cover this because it's going to be simply too expensive. So there are simply dollars at stake here, and you're looking at support groups that probably can round up $1,000 if they're lucky, up against $1 trillion. It's simply, the smart money has always been betting on Goliath. I ask people, well, tell me one time when the little guy beats the big guy, and everybody says, well, look at David and Goliath. I said, look, it's been 2,000 years. Come up with a better example.
We must be due again.
Yeah, don't you think?
Yeah, I think it's time again. Mm-hmm. But I also have a feeling that somehow in the long...
there are a lot of different illnesses that are environmental illnesses. This is like the tip of the iceberg. If you go into a family or you go into a neighborhood, a lot of times you're going to see multiple chemical sensitivities. The neighbors may have lupus. The next door house may have multiple sclerosis. The next house may have leukemia.
Hasn't this happened with else? What wasn't that, multiple sclerosis?
Multiple sclerosis was considered a psychosomatic disorder for 100 years. Until they could finally document that the myelin sheath was breaking down.
It feels like they just need information to know to make connections, to start making connections, and that it isn't just that we're kind of like canaries have been used before, but like the what I'm trying to say?
Warning system. And, part of the problem, too, is there's the comment that people say, well, it doesn't bother me. I say, well, I can't go into your house because your carpeting's too new. And they say, well, it doesn't bother me. Well, there was a time when new carpeting didn't bother me. There was a time when perfume and all those other things didn't bother me. And when you find out that they bother you, it's too late. And that's the real problem with education, is that people think, well, it's you people out there, you have this thing. I'm so lucky I don't have it. Well, we were all lucky at one time and didn't have it either. Although there have been a few children that were born with MCS, from particularly families who had large pesticide exposures. But as a rule, most of us did not have it at one time.
I think this goes back in a lot of cases I see to blame the victim. In the 40s.
Big time.
Big time.
Well, in the 40s it was in the 40s if you got raped, what were you wearing? What were you doing out at night? And we didn't focus on the rapist. And I hate to use this term, but a lot of times I see this as chemical rape when I go in and I interview a 7-year-old child who has leukemia, and I know that the company knew that that product was causing leukemia in the 1950s. And I know that they know, and there have been lawsuits filed against them, but it's simply cheaper to deal with these people one at a time than it is to correct the problem. And I would use the example, everybody's fallen down. I've met hundreds of people who have fallen down stairs. Some people break their necks and some people don't. If you did an intricate, detailed study, maybe you could find that, bigger, stronger people don't break their necks. Well, you still wouldn't tolerate a madman going around pushing people downstairs. Just because some people aren't affected and some people are, you're missing the entire point. You're not focusing on what's happening. You need to focus on the people who are affected. You need to find out why they differ and either stop the injuries to begin with or treat the injured. Because this is a terrible drain on society. For every injured individual, that's one paycheck out of society that supports a car dealer, new housing, and it starts to drain money out of Social Security, out of workman's comp, out of society. So this is a terrible cost for society. This is an epidemic, and it's a financial epidemic that society has to recognize.
We've determined that they know that we all have trouble getting in there. We've met with interim committees in the lobby with the door open of the Capitol. We've met in a church in Taos. And also they were able to grant me telephone access to testify as a spokesperson for the task force during some of the legislation. But almost all the people, when we talk about having a problem in the Roundhouse, legislators and also just the clerical staff all say, they don't say, oh, I don't know what you're talking about. They say, oh my God, I just hate it here. My eyes run. I get a headache. I cough when I'm in here. There was one of the security men who said that he'd worked there for a few years and he was going to have to quit, that he couldn't breathe there anymore. And so we have a real example of poor indoor air quality at our own Capitol.
Part of the thing that industry deals with is acceptable risk, that if a certain thing only makes a few people sick, maybe it's acceptable. Well, that is only acceptable if you're not the person that's made ill. I mean, I am ill, and that is not acceptable. Often they see us that are a little bit healthier, that are able to get out and speak, and they don't see the people like her who are so ill. I've seen patients in clinics that were, just barely hanging on, and then I find out later they have died, young people. And, they're not seeing the worst of us at all.
Well, I'm also Hispanic veterans who were poisoned in the Gulf, who have this multiple chemical sensitivity. I've talked with 2 African Americans who worked in Fort Worth, and they worked at the U.S. Treasury printing money there. And the inks and the solvents both made them sick. The U.S. Treasury said, you have multiple chemical sensitivity, and the U.S. Treasury was smart enough to send these people to an environmentally and occupationally intelligent physician so that they get treatment. So it isn't a woman's disease, it's a disease of exposure. And if you're exposed, whether you're an African American, Hispanic, Asian, I've interviewed hundreds of people, and I think it crosses all lines. It's a disease of who can afford medical care more than anything else.
To lose weight.
Let me ask my question.
Okay.
How old is that shirt?
This shirt is as old as the hills.
Okay, and then look over to Sharon. Back to Susan. Or whoever.
I feel like we're playing like that musical memory game.
Okay, and over to Anne.
It was a fascinating conversation.
Likewise, I'm sure. At the medical school at the University of Oklahoma.
Okay. Wait. Stop. Okay.
Yeah, I was watching a program, and I think they were talking about alternative health, alternative healing, and things. But the spokeswoman made a point that any new idea that's out, at first it's ignored, and then when you get to the point that you can't ignore it anymore, then you ridicule it. And then when it reached some sort of critical mass and you can't ridicule it anymore, then the person who was doing the ridiculing suddenly discovers it as their own and then pronounces it as fact. And so I think that when I was first sick, the MCS was still pretty much ignored. But we've reached some kind of a number and a voice that they can't ignore us anymore. So now they're ridiculing us, and it's nasty and it's vicious. But I can hope that the process will go on, and someday that they will discover it as their own truth, and I'll be glad to give it to them as their discovery, as long as something happens that's positive.